Tonight on the Daily Debrief, the nation's top attorney is out at the request of the president. A jury is set to hear the case of the accused head of a Mexican drug cartel. Plus,
this is a case of self-defense.
Opening statements in a so-called road rage manslaughter trial. That's straight ahead on the Daily Debrief for Wednesday, November 7th. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Debrief tonight. The nation's top attorney and top law enforcement officer is out on this day after Election Day. Attorney General Jeff Sessions resigned today, reportedly at the request of President Trump. President Trump issued a tweet thanking Sessions for his service and wishing him well. His replacement will be former U.S. Attorney Matthew Whitaker. Whitaker was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Iowa from 2004 to 2009. Whitaker assumes control of the special investigation led by Robert Mueller into Russian interference with the U.S. elections. Sessions did not control that investigation due to a legal conflict. The fallout from this announcement continues to pour in at this hour. For analysis, head to lawandcrime.com. Back to court tonight, where in Florida, a defendant, Armando Baptista, faces manslaughter charges in what's been described as a road rage stabbing incident. Fakardine Knight and his girlfriend, Wendy Gambolis, left a party one night. At an intersection, they came across a gold Chevrolet Impala driven by defendants Armando Baptista and Demetrius Elder. Bottom line, when the Impala did not move, Knight honked the horn, then got out of the car. So did the defendant and the other man in the Impala. That led to a fight where Knight was stabbed and killed. It's a big he said, she said over who did what and when. The girlfriend said the victim was merely offering a handshake. She accused Baptista of throwing the first punch and claimed Baptista and Elder stabbed Knight as she and Knight were walking away. That's the version of the story that the authorities believe. Prosecutors originally sought murder charges against Demetrius Elder and Armando Baptista, but those charges were downgraded to manslaughter. The jury in the Demetrius Elder case this summer knocked things down further to a misdemeanor. Here was that verdict.
The jury find as follows to the defendant, Demetrius Omega Elder. In this case, defendant is guilty of the lesser included crime of culpable negligence. So say we all.
So the jury in the Demetrius Elder case went for that lesser-included charge of culpable negligence, a misdemeanor carrying up to 1 year in jail. The judge ruled that no information about Elder's conviction on that lesser charge can be used in this case. So let's begin with opening statements today against co-defendant Armando Baptista.
On April 25th of 2014 was an unremarkable Friday night. People went to work. People made plans with friends. People make plans for the future. But on that day, Fakardine Mohammed Knight met a bloody and violent end. And that happened at the hands of two individuals. The defendant, Armando Baptista, as well as Demetrius Elder. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear about Demetrius Elder. But that proceedings and anything in regards to him is for another jury.
The prosecutor conveyed the incident from the viewpoint of the girlfriend who was in the victim's car.
Wendy watches this all go down. She's in her car, in the driver's seat with the headlights on. She sees her boyfriend get out of the car, walk up to the car in front, and stop about even with the gas cap. At that point, Armando Baptista, the defendant in this case, gets out of the car, opens the passenger door, stands up against the passenger door, and has a conversation with Mohammed. You're going to hear that Mohammed, when Wendy first picked him up, had a red Solo cup in his hand. And he held it in his right hand, and he's carrying on a conversation with Mr. Baptista. Wendy can't tell you exactly what that conversation was, but she was inside the car. But she can tell you about the body language and the demeanor of both of those individuals. The next thing that happens is she sees Mohammed take the cup from his right hand, switch it to his left, walk up and put his hand out for a handshake. At that point, she sees blood flowing because Armando Baptista, with a knife in his hand, strikes Mohammed Knight.
The state continued by describing the victim's injuries, but not a detailed account of exactly what happened.
The altercation continues. Wendy didn't know there was a knife at this point. She sees her boyfriend all of a sudden attacked for no reason by Mr. Baptista. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that Mr. Muhammad Knight had 8 different sharp force injuries, meaning from a knife or another sharp object. You're going to hear that some of those wounds pierced his heart, his lungs. That the manner of death was that he bled to death, loss of blood from those injuries.
Things became a little more heated when the prosecutor tried to quote Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud said once upon a time that we assume a special attitude towards the deceased.
Objection, argument.
Sustained, continue.
That we have some sort of admiration for them, like they
Objection,
have some feet. It's not an argument, Your Honor.
Is and is sustained, continue.
The state is not going to say that Mr. Knight, the victim, was a choir boy that went to church twice on Sundays. You're going to hear he was drinking. You're going to hear that he had a bag of weed in his back pocket. You're going to hear that he had alpha PVP, flocka in his system. You're going to hear that he had cocaine in his system. We're not hiding that. We have to show that he committed an intentional act that caused the death of this individual that was not excusable or justifiable.
The prosecution wrapped up opening statements by focusing on the elements of the offense and by explaining the burden of proof.
One of the things that's important for you to remember is those 2 elements are all the state has to prove. The victim is dead, the defendant caused it. Reasonable doubt as to the color of the car, the color of someone's shirt. That is not a reasonable doubt as to the elements. That's what we are here to focus on, is the elements. We'd be here till Christmas after next if we had to prove every person's shirt, shoe, size, and color. So, ladies and gentlemen, your job is to look at that checklist and hold the state to our burden.
Former federal prosecutor Francey Hakes is with us tonight on the debrief. So, Francey, generally speaking, how do you think the state did on that opening?
I liked the beginning, Aaron. I thought she did a good job of laying out the case. I think it's especially powerful talking about the power of the strikes that caused the death of Mr. Knight. Where I think she fell down a little there was at the end. I think as a prosecutor, you're always making a mistake when you have to explain to the jury the things that you're not going to prove or that you don't have to prove them or why you don't have to prove them. You've lost the argument at that point.
You know, I wanted to ask about that objection there. I saw where the prosecution was going. I also saw where the defense was going. I think that the first objection was certainly sound, and the second one seemed sound as well. But then once the prosecutor got back on her feet, I said, oh, okay, now I get what she's doing here. And maybe the objection shouldn't have stuck had everyone known exactly where that was going.
Yeah, that was an interesting little sideshow. I mean, you know, as an attorney in the courtroom, you don't want to object to everything that's objectionable because, frankly, you'd be objecting every other minute. But what was interesting to me about that exchange was that the prosecutor actually ignored the judge's ruling. Mm-hmm. He sustained the objection, and she just kept right on quoting Sigmund Freud.
Well, you know, look, I'm reminded of a judge I knew years ago who would put prosecutors on a short leash and give defendants a long leash just in the name of fairness, and I wonder if that's some of what was going on there. Let's move along now to the defense. The defense characterized the events in this case very, very differently.
This is absolutely 100% a case of self-defense. On April 25th, 2014, Armando Baptista is sitting in the passenger seat of a car, waiting at a stop sign, having no idea that he's about to experience the most terrifying moments of his life. Within a matter of seconds, his door flies open. A stranger is pummeling him. He's trapped. That stranger, beer bottle in hand, smacks him over the head. Once, twice, the bottle breaks. Armando is sitting there trying to comprehend what's going on. He grabs the attacker's arm. He's pushing back. He's fighting back. And the stranger is on top of him. A 6'2", 228-pound man is on top of him. And Armando reacts. He does the only thing that he can think of, and he pulls out a pocket knife that he carries for work, and he defends himself. He defends himself in the only way that he knows how. This is a case of self-defense.
There, the defense described events at a party where the defendants and the victims were all present before that street-side stabbing at the stop sign. The defense says the victim was the first aggressor.
When they arrive at the party, they socialize a bit with Armando's brother-in-law. They haven't seen him in a while. At some point, Mr. Knight arrives at that party. And Armando and Demetrius don't know Mr. Knight. They don't know him at all. And there's this awkward moment where Mr. Knight comes up to Armando and asks him his name. But Armando has no idea who this person is. Eventually, Demetrius tells Armando, it's time to go. And the two get in their car, and they make their way unknowingly to that fateful stop sign. What Armando and Demetrius don't know is that immediately after they leave, Mr. Knight gets in the car with his girlfriend Wendy, and they follow them up to that stop sign. Now, the state wants you to believe that Armando got out of the car and confronted Mr. Knight. But that's not true. He never got out of that car. Mr. Knight reaches, when Mr. Knight is at the stop sign, he reaches over, he honks the horn. Mr. Knight gets out of the car. Mr. Knight approaches the passenger side door of the car in front of him. Armando never got out of that car. Mr. Knight reaches over, he opens the door, and he gets on top of Armando, pummeling him with a beer bottle.
Okay, the defense went on to quote Florida self-defense law to wrap up.
You're going to hear that in Florida, a person has a right to defend themselves if they are in a place that they have a right to be, and they are in a reasonable fear of being killed, of suffering great bodily harm, or of being the victim of a forcible felony. Armando Baptista was in fear. He feared for his safety. He feared he was going to die. Now, Armando has no idea why Mr. Knight came up to the car and did this. You're going to hear some evidence that Mr. Knight had a reason to hold a grudge against Armando. And this incident may have been a result of that grudge. Armando is sitting in the passenger seat of a car, waiting at a stop sign, when his door is opened and he is attacked by a stranger with a beer bottle. The only reason that Armando took out that knife is to defend himself. He defended himself in the only way that he could.
Former federal prosecutor Francey Hakes. Francey, same question this time around. Your general thoughts on where the defense was going there?
Well, this is an interesting battle of the opening statements here, Aaron. The defense attorney did a good job, I think, of talking about self-defense, but the jury has to be left wondering, these are two dramatically different stories, and who's telling the truth? You've got a beer bottle versus a red Solo cup. You've got the defendant seated in the car versus standing. And of course, the question then really becomes, what does the girlfriend say versus what does the forensic evidence prove? Forensic evidence should show whether there was a beer bottle broken at the scene, whether there's blood in the seat suggesting that her client was seated and not standing when the assault happens. And then, of course, there's the force of the wounds themselves, and being stabbed 8 times does not, to me, raise an inference of self-defense, but maybe.
Okay, so the defense told jurors that the state needs to prove that this was not self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. In the first case against the co-defendant, jurors seemed to really get stuck on that, or should I say the state really got stuck on being able to prove that it wasn't self-defense.
Well, then that's right. The state has the burden. If the defense raises the defense of self-defense, the state has the burden to disprove it, just like they have the burden to prove guilt. And that's why I think the forensic evidence in this case is going to be so critical. One other thing I noted that I thought was a surprise, I took notes and wrote an exact quote. She said that her client, Armando Baptista, has no idea why he was attacked. Now, Aaron, that might not have signaled very much to the jury, but to me, as an attorney, it says to me that that man is going to testify, or at least she's promising the jury that he will.
Interesting observation. We'll check in with you again in a couple of minutes here, Francey. Still ahead tonight on the Daily Debrief. We're not finished in that Baptista case. Witnesses take the stand to try to make sense of exactly what happened at that Florida stop sign. Plus, a sentencing date is set for the Colorado man who admits to killing his wife, his children, and his unborn child. That's after the break here on the Daily Debrief. Welcome back, everybody. New details are emerging in the plea deal of a Colorado man accused of murdering his wife and his daughters. Chris Watts pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of his wife Shannon and his daughters Bella and Celeste. The plea deal also covers the death of the couple's unborn child. In total, Watts admitted to 9 charges. The plea allows him to avoid the death penalty. Authorities discovered Shannon's body in a shallow grave and the daughters in oil tanks where Chris Watts worked. The prosecutor says he has a better idea of what motivated the killing, but said he could not release more details until after a sentencing, which is scheduled a week from Monday. Once escaped from a Mexican prison. Joaquin Guzman, better known as El Chapo, faces drug trafficking charges in the United States, along with accusations he murdered his rivals. 7 women, 5 men, and 6 alternates will hear the case beginning Tuesday. The judge refused to swear in the jury until next week. He said one juror wept while privately telling him she was afraid of being on the panel. Defense attorneys argued that people should not be released from jury service, in one attorney's words, with just a few tears. Let's get a check of other incidents making headlines with Anthony Velez.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on Law&Crime.com and across the country. Dennis Hoff, the owner of several legal brothels in Las Vegas and the would-be politician who died in October at one of his brothels following a campaign rally, posthumously won his state legislative race in Nevada. The 72-year-old author of Art of the Pimp was reportedly found dead at his Love Ranch Vegas bordello with no apparent signs of foul play. Hoff shocked pundits when he mounted a Donald Trump-style campaign and unseated a Republican incumbent in a state primary during the summer. County officials will now appoint another Republican to the vacant seat in Hoff's place. A father of a murdered 5-year-old girl is facing criminal charges after lunging at the accused killer in court. 37-year-old Ryan Burgee is accused of killing his girlfriend's 5-year-old daughter, Hartley Anderson, on November 2nd in what prosecutors described as a very violent beating. Burgee was in court for his first appearance on charges of second-degree murder when Anderson's biological father, Peter Anderson, unsuccessfully lunged at Burgee. Burgee is being held on $5 million bail. An 11-year-old in Ohio is facing criminal charges after he reportedly stole his mother's car and led police on a high-speed chase, which was caught on camera. The unidentified adolescent driver reportedly took his mother's car for a joyride before officers spotted him parked near a vacant fire department building in Brooklyn. That's when the young driver took off and led officers on a high-speed chase before crashing his mother's vehicle. The boy now faces felony charges. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for the Daily Debrief.
Back to testimony now in the Armando Baptista trial. The first witness was a police officer who described being the first at the scene.
I observed a large crowd of people scattered, and I also observed the victim laying on the ground on the swale. It was grass. There was an individual applying pressure to his chest using a white towel. I immediately started rendering aid. I used the same towel that that individual was using, and I applied pressure, and I immediately called for rescue to step it up. I asked him, if he could tell me a suspect description, any vehicle description, that sort of thing, so I can put it out on the radio for other officers to be on the lookout. But he wasn't talking. He was, in shock. He was gasping for oxygen. The towel had blood on it. He had a white shirt which was, drenched in blood, and it was slipping through the shirt.
That officer did not stop rendering aid until paramedics arrived at the scene. Up next, the detective who spoke with the victim's girlfriend. Remember, the state's case is based largely on that girlfriend's statements. This is cross-examination.
Am I correct that at no point did she ever tell you that the passenger walked towards her, towards Mr. Knight?
She told me that he exited the vehicle and a fight ensued.
That Mr. Knight exited the vehicle, correct?
No. Yeah, the deceased approached the car. He said he got out. He said, "Wait here," something to that effect. He approached the vehicle with the two alleged in the car, and they had a minute chat, and then the passenger exited the vehicle and a fight ensued.
Okay. She never told you that the passenger walked towards Mr. Knight, is that
No,
correct?
correct.
Right. She never told you that Mr. Knight tried to shake the passenger's hand, is that correct?
I don't recall anything about that now.
She never told you anything about Mr. Knight having a red Solo cup, is that correct?
No.
She never told you anything. Did she ever tell you how it was that Mr. Knight ended up on top of the passenger inside the passenger seat?
She did tell me that happened.
She told you that happened?
Yes.
That Mr. Knight was on top of the passenger in the passenger seat?
Yes.
Did she ever tell you how that happened?
They were fighting, and it wound up that way. That was my understanding.
Okay, but she didn't give you any details as to the mechanism of how Mr. Knight ends up in the passenger seat, correct?
No.
Back now to Francey Hakes. This was an afternoon, Francey, of law enforcement witnesses. Interesting because if I'm remembering this properly, in the co-defendant's trial over the summer, the testimony started with the girlfriend, or at least she was up very, very early. This time along, it's a different prosecutor. The old prosecutor left to go into private practice. Here it's a different strategy. Why might that be?
Well, Aaron, I was taught that you should always put your strongest witnesses up first because they're the first thing the jury's going to hear after opening statements, and specifically after the defense opening statement. So I want them to hear from my strongest witnesses, the people who tell the best story. And maybe this prosecutor thought the girlfriend didn't tell the best story.
Yeah, I agree. I'm waiting to see where this is going to go. So, Francey Hakes, good to see you here on the Debrief. A reminder that Law and Crime will be streaming the Armando Baptista trial beginning tomorrow morning. From all of us at Law and Crime, have a good evening.